Greetings to ED621C, Module 10, Creating Rubrics, Checklists, and Rating Scales. In our case, will be your culminating performance task. So some of you may be familiar with them, some of you may be new to rubrics, but we'll look at why are rubrics useful. They provide authentic assessment based directly on learning targets, which are your objectives and goals. They are intended to reduce teacher-to-teacher variations in grading, so you have consistency amongst grading. They provide both a qualitative and a quantitative measure of student success and growth, and they help a teacher assess student products more objectively and fairly on a set of uniform criteria that everybody is assessed by. So it decreases teacher bias in evaluations and grading. And they provide students clarity about the criteria upon which they will be assessed, so they know what's expected of them. So from success criteria to rubric, you need to know that a rubric is a criterion-based scoring guide. It's based on the criteria, the success criteria you've designed for your culminating performance task. It's based on a fixed measurement scale, usually 3 to 6 points. Descriptions of the characteristics for each score point give more specific detail about what needs to be in the product the student is creating, and describes those degrees of quality, proficiency, or understanding along a continuum versus a checklist or rating scale. So we're not making checklists and we're not making rating scales. The rubric that assesses increasing control of the 6 facets of understanding is designed as a continuum, and you'll find that rubric in Wiggins and McTighe Understanding by Design, page 178 and 179. So that shows you how the different levels of performance and proficiency. The rubric answers these questions. By what criteria should performance be judged and discriminated? Where should we look and what should we look for to judge the performance success? And how should the different levels of quality, proficiency, or understanding be described and distinguished from one another? So we're looking to see how we can distinguish between high-level performance that needs work, or performance that does not meet the standards or the criteria. There are a couple types of rubrics. There is the holistic rubric, which gives you an overall impression of students' work. It yields a single score or rating for a product or performance. We are not using a holistic rubric. They're nice. I like using them myself, but we're not using them in this case. We're going to make an analytic rubric. It divides a product or performance into distinct traits or dimensions and judges each separately. A distinct score is provided for each trait or dimension. For example, you would have, for 6 traits of writing, you'll see, if any of you have used this before, the dimensions of idea, organization, voice, word choice, sentence fluency, and conventions are traits or dimensions on that rubric. And then the proficiency level moves across from not met to exceeds. For our purpose of assessing understanding, an analytic rubric is preferable because it provides a much higher quality of feedback that provides specific information to students and parents. And the other reason is that your CPT is a complex task. And so you want to have very clear levels and descriptions of performance. So now we're going to take a breeze through 14 tips for designing great rubrics. And always remember, it's all about the students, not about the principal or somebody that's going to read the rubric, but who's going to use it, and that's the student. So the first thing you want to consider is that you don't want to make task-specific rubrics. Now, that does not mean that it isn't related specifically to the task, to the performance task you're creating. What it means is that you don't want to create a rubric for one specific part of that task. You want to make it for the complexity of the task. To make a really good rubric takes a lot of thought and work. If you're going to invest enough effort to make a good rubric, be sure you can use it in a variety of assessments. So use your time wisely. And that way you can do it by creating dimensions and categories that are broad enough that you can add information to them when you need to, but they can be applicable to many different tasks and performance products. Creating a more general rubric is not only more efficient use of your time, it makes possible for you to track student improvement on successive products. So, for example, you have your exceeds expectation, meets, approaches, and does not meet. This can be used for anything. What's inside the rubric is very specific to your culminating performance task. If these are elements in your success criteria, then you're going to put them here. You don't need to make them so broad that they're not useful for the task that you're designing. At the same time, as I'm mentioning, don't be excessively general. While you're being careful to avoid making task-specific rubrics, don't let yourself go to the other extreme. For example, you probably don't want to make a project rubric and try to use it to judge everything from a digital montage to a PowerPoint presentation on market economics. Remember instead the golden mean and aim for a mid-level generalization in your rubric. You might include part of a PowerPoint montage, you might include part of a writing task, but if you're doing a performance, maybe you're just going to focus on voice and not the whole entire performance. It depends on what your goal is in terms of what your students need to be learning and learning to do. Do avoid dysfunctional detail. I recently saw a rubric that was 11 pages long. While it was called a rubric, it was really more like an inventory or a checklist, so that's the other thing you have to watch out for. It asked the scorer to rate everything from the quality of the title page to the number of people who helped in producing the product. So you want to have your rubric address the real core of what the learning targets are trying to get at. But give enough information in each cell so that another person can use the rubric for scoring that same assignment without having to guess at what the criteria mean. And that's the inter-rater reliability that I talk about and we talk about. General rule, keep it to one page in no smaller than 12-point font. Keep it simple, always. Focus on a limited number of dimensions. Dimensions are the main areas or parts of the work you care about that describe student understanding. Dimensions tell you where to look when you are viewing a product or performance. So on this particular rubric, you can see the dimensions going down the side. Most of you will create rubrics that look like this. For example, if you are making a restaurant rubric, your dimensions might be food, service, atmosphere, and price. Or if you're rating a physical fitness, the dimensions might be strength, endurance, and flexibility. By limiting the number of dimensions to no more than 4 or 5, you'll be able to do a more thorough job of developing each one, and you'll be forced to set priorities for what really matters in the project. Once again, what really matters. You do want to rely on descriptive language in the performance criteria. This is probably the most challenging part of designing the rubric. The most effective descriptions you can use are specific descriptions. That means avoiding words like good and excellent. What do those words mean? You have to be specific. At the same time, don't rely on numbers, such as number of sources, as your crutch, because that's not descriptive, it's just numeric, and it doesn't give you a sense of the heart of what you're trying to have students produce. Instead of saying find excellent sources or use 3 sources, focus your rubric language on the quality of the sources students find or produce, in this case, find, and on the best possible way of aligning that data to the work. Again, thinking about the big picture. For example, what is the difference between using Wikipedia or a primary source? It isn't about the number of sources, and excellent is too vague for students. It's about the quality of the source. Wikipedia has many hands in the pot, and a primary source comes from the original place of where it was created. And that's the quality, that's the deeper quality of a particular source, in this case, if you're doing a research project or a social studies project. Be descriptive and specific. That's your challenge. Use measurable criteria all the same, and this is, you go back to your Bloom's taxonomy. As much as possible, choose criteria that you can actually observe and or quantify, or that you can at least mark as present or not present. For example, in our restaurant analogy, we can measure things such as how long it takes the server to show up, to take our order, or how much fat and cholesterol is in the food. We can measure these things. We can determine whether or not those things are in place, or is it too noisy to carry on a conversation, or if we spy cockroaches scurrying along the baseboard, God forbid. In our classroom rubrics, we want to look for the same sorts of concrete, measurable criteria, using measurable verbs. Is it legible? Do the links work? Because we can measure these things. We want to make sure to use actionable language. Design performance indicators carefully and keep them objective. Now again, this is the challenging part of designing your rubric. As you strive for measurability, you may be tempted to use relative terms. Avoid them. For example, in elaborating on criteria, many rubrics include terms such as poor, fair, good, excellent, or minimal, or adequate, and fully developed. What do those words mean? What's the difference between fair and good service? How much detail is enough for an idea to be fully developed? You have to be specific, and the taxonomy and just the way you design them is your key to success there. When the rubric results will be viewed by students, it's also important to consider the emotional aspects of value-laden terms, such as boring or poorly presented. And that's a challenge when you have students help you make the rubrics. You have to help them, keep them from being using these emotionally laden terms. So even when students are helping design the rubric, it's important to keep them professional in their descriptors. To provide specific feedback without discouraging your students, it's better to identify the actual traits you're looking for that constitute unacceptable versus acceptable performance. If an acceptable presentation is one that begins with a hook, ties facts together, and ends with a strong point, then say so. Those are qualitative criteria that can be measured. Aim for 4 or 5 levels. Typically, you'll see rubrics with 3 to 5 performance levels, sometimes even 6 or more levels, which makes discriminating between the quality of performance indicators very difficult. For this assignment, it's recommended to use 4 levels. The problem with using 3 levels is that you probably won't be able to make fine enough discriminations. This will depend on the grade level, however. With very young students, 3 levels can be plenty. It is fair and acceptable to give students feedback on work that does not meet the goal, objective, or standard of the task. You need to be prepared to have a descriptor which indicates that the work does not meet the objective on any or most of the criteria being evaluated. Parents want to see these too. It is always important to explain the rubric and use it to the students the use of it to the students before you use it. This will defer a lot of confusion. So you always want to deconstruct the rubric with the students and go through it, have them ask questions. So if there's any clarification they need, that's the time to do it. Keep the distance between levels equal. Basically, your progression should be kind of a natural progression from not acceptable to exceeds. The difference between a 1 and a 2 on your rubric should represent the same amount of betterness as the difference between a 2 and a 3 or a 3 and a 4. And again, this is a little bit challenging, so you have to put your mind to it. But put another way, work that scores 4 on your rubric should be 4 times better than work that scores 1. Statisticians call this an interval scale. In the messy business of classroom assessment, this is something to strive for. Creating graduated performance indicators for the descriptors helps you avoid creating just an ordinal scale using just numbers that merely ranks one product or performance as better than another. That's why you avoid just numbers in your descriptors, in your performance indicators. The more interval-like your scale, the sounder your rubric will be. Number 11, use parallel language. This is the other thing you need to make sure to do through your performance indicators. Make sure that the language from column to column is similar, that the syntax and wording correspond. That is called parallel construction. Of course, the words will change somewhat for each section or assignment, as will the expectations, but in terms of readability and consistency, you need to make sure that the rubric can be easily read from left to right or right to left, depending on how you've designed it. In addition, if you have an indicator described in one category, then it needs to be described in the next category too. Whether it is about having or not having something doesn't matter. It needs to be in each category. This is all about clarity, specificity, and transparency to students. And all this needs to be in student-friendly language, because who's using the rubric? The students are using the rubric. So the example here is, this is a verbal presentation, language control for ELLs. Meets standards, easy to understand, and there are a few spelling and usage errors. Message communicated is the same thing as being able to understand something, but it isn't easy. It's just the message is communicated. Some spelling and usage errors do not impede communication. There are some spelling and usage errors that do not impede, but it still doesn't impede communicating, which is the qualitative nature of that performance. Whereas not acceptable, messages not communicated fully, and significant spelling and usage errors, and if this were a well-constructed rubric, it would say significant spelling and usage errors that impede communication and make it hard to understand. So you've got the quality of the performance with the same language covering the same points across each rubric, across each performance indicator. You'll see in the corner here, this is really the best way to design the language in your performance indicators, where you have the students. It's the student. I can do whatever it is you're asking them to do. Use student-friendly language. If the students can't understand the rubric, then you cannot expect it to guide instruction, reflection, and/or assessment. If you want students to engage in using the rubric, they have to understand it. Make sure the language is at the student's learning level, that it is developmentally appropriate. So don't use high school words and language with first graders. As college students, it's sometimes easy to do that, especially when you're not familiar with creating rubrics and you're learning this content. You need to think about your audience and who's going to be reading and using the rubric. If you use academic language or concepts in the rubric, then you'll need time to teach the students those meanings and concepts before they use the rubric. And you need to it's also a good idea, but you don't always have to do this. But it's really terrific in terms of buy-in, is to include students in creating or adapting the rubric. Now for this class, it's hard to do that because you really can't. You don't have the time or maybe the students to do so. But when you have the chance to, have the students help you create the rubric. 2 heads are often better than 1, especially in the creative process. By involving your students in the process of constructing or adapting the rubric that will be used to score their work, you accomplish several things. Your students will have a head start on understanding what your expectations are because they've helped you build it. So there's not going to be a lot of extra explanations. They'll know where the target is. They're also more likely to buy into the work that you're asking them to do and strive to do their best. But most importantly, their good ideas will add to the quality of the rubric itself, with some guidance perhaps. So these are some comments that were given to a teacher who had made a math rubric. And they were appropriate enough for me to want to share these with you because these are something that you need to consider as you're creating your rubrics. Provide a copy of the rubric for students to self-assess. So even though you're using it to assess students, give it to them also to assess their own work. Giving students the rubric was huge. From that day on, students showing work ceased to be a problem. I was showing their work, their math work, how they got to their problems. They all realized that everything in class became an opportunity for assessment, and we are thinking like assessors here, aren't we? I was clear about my expectations, and they rose to meet them. So that's why student investment is so critical, and to have students use the rubric for self-assessment. Think of a rubric as a description of the quality of thinking. In general, avoid raw counts with rubrics, and I'll say it again. I've been saying it. Don't use just numbers like 1, 2, 3 to 4, 5 to 6, 7 to 8, because all it does is count numbers of things. It doesn't give you the quality of the work, and it doesn't describe the quality of the work. It helps to give students an example of what each rubric point might look like. What does it mean to identify skills? Do they need to write out the name of the standard or simply use it in their work? All this needs to be considered and clarified as students move through a rubric. Now let's go ahead and deconstruct a rubric. There are 4 basic parts of the rubric. You've got your title, of course, and you'll have some information that you need to put on the top of the actual assignment that you're creating in terms of the essential questions in the student prompt. You have your scale levels, 1, 2, 3, 4, and they have some descriptive level name on them, not just a number. And you have your dimensions of content, 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5. And what's in here are called performance indicators. The task description is your student prompt. The scale of performance is levels of performance, and the dimensions are the elements from your success criteria that need to be leveled into your rubric. So we're going to analyze 3 rubrics just for some language that they've had. This is a rubric that a teacher used with her students on an animal assignment. They needed to develop and then explain a product that related to their chosen animal. So if you look at the rubric itself, we have some emotionally laden language that was used. Boring, sloppy, unprepared, not finished. Now sloppy, you might think that that's a good qualitative word, but the reality of it is you don't know what sloppy means. What does sloppy actually mean in the presentation? Not practiced, quiet voice, mistakes, and so forth. So accurate, looks real. What does looking real look like? Creative, real looking. Anything that's in red is really, and of course bullets, which are not acceptable in the rubrics that you're going to be creating. We need a statement that says what the motion looks like. So not only that, but how does motion relate to these other levels? So you're looking across the levels too. So what works in this rubric? The students were involved in its creation. This is some of the words. Teacher helped with the structure and the clarity. And the wording is general enough that the rubric can be repurposed, but in reality it needs more specific language, which is what doesn't work. Difference between looks real and real looking. Define creative, define boring. Maybe divide a dimension in 2, oral presentation skills and appearance quality of the product. So you actually have 2 different levels in the rubric, 2 different performance or dimensions. In this project, the class was making sun posters, and the students were using this to self-assess their work. And we have 2 of the dimensions here. And you see where the red wording is what needs clarity. And so of course you're going to put different, you can use these levels if you want, but really having more descriptive labels is also very useful. The dimensions will also be specific to the task at hand, always. What works in this rubric? The 2 dimensions shown here are really specifications which would lend themselves well to a checklist also. Commensurate dimensions might be quality of drawing and information accuracy. Too many performance categories. We've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 categories. That's a lot. That's especially when you're having to figure out what's the difference between each category. Combine these first 3 into one category and tighten up the language in the performance criteria. What doesn't work? Example of a task-specific rubric makes it unuseful for other projects. You know, that's not necessarily a bad thing, but you have a framework for your rubric that you can use for other projects. It won't take that much to make changes in it. Many of the criteria are ambiguous. Minimum effort given, researched well, valuable information. What do those terms actually mean? Differentiate carelessly done drawing versus poorly done, researched well versus extra effort given to research. How are those different? One needs to be very specific about what that looks like. The 2 dimensions shown here are really specifications, which would also lend them well to an assignment checklist. But, you know, it's okay. I would expect this kind of specificity in your rubrics. Not all rubrics are, it's not a black and white putting rubrics together. I think more importantly is how clear your descriptive criteria are inside your rubric. Finally, we have one about a written presentation. We're analyzing one. They had to write about their presentation, the students did. And we chose 2 dimensions, detail and opinion. There were other dimensions that were also included in the rubric. And you can see once again, we've got 4 levels. This is good. 4 levels of performance indicators. We've got 2 of the dimensions. This particular one had 1, 2 there, 3, 4, 5, 6 dimensions, which is fine, and it's not too many. More than that probably would be too many. What works in this rubric is that it is a simple sound rubric that could be used in a range of different assignments. Dimensions represent important aspects of the work of the 4 performance levels. Dimensions represent important aspects of the work, and the 4 performance levels are helpful. Also notice it's still about writing. So even though they're general, it's still about writing. Most of the other criteria are clear and well differentiated, but what needs work are the differences between details that add to the overall clarity and organization and those that support the main idea and could use clarification. What does details that add to overall clarity and organization mean? What is use details to support main idea? You need that parallel language. So if you're looking at clarity and organization, You're looking at clarity and organization all the way through. Here you have details are missing. Ties in right. You've got details, 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 but clarity and organization are missing. Supporting main idea, that's a different thing. So you need to include and have parallel language through all three. Opinions are balanced and made in a point-by-point manner. I think that's clear. Opinions are presented and balanced. Maybe not quite as clear. Few opinions are given. How's that different from opinions are given? And opinions are not given. So the hardest places to make your distinguishing performance indicators are levels 2 and 3. Level 4 should be exceeds and with no errors, with nothing wrong with it, like a perfect performance. And inadequate should be next to a really bad performance, something that is not adequate to the standard. So it's very clear that whatever needed to be present was not present. So it's usually the two middle performance areas that need attention to differentiating between all 4 levels. So sometimes you overlap with those two, sometimes you overlap with 3 and 4. You always have to kind of keep an eye on that when you're designing your performance indicators. So you have the 6 facets of understanding from Wiggins and McTighe. One of the important things in your rubrics is that you are not looking at lower level knowledge and comprehension. Like, listing 5 words. There's nothing, that doesn't mean anything unless it's part of the lower end of the continuum. Whereas on the upper end, they not only list the words, they explain the words, and they use it in context in a sentence or a piece of writing. So then all of a sudden you've gone from Bloom's taxonomy, just knowledge and listing things, to all the way up to some of these higher level performance skills that students need to be able to do. So you want your rubric to move students into these levels, and as kind of gradually moving from like not having these present to how, and this is your culminating performance task. Your culminating performance task includes these elements in it. So make sure that shows up in your rubric. This is an example rubric that's also provided in the module itself, and you'll notice this is just a structural piece. There are 4 performance levels. The performance levels have descriptive language. These meals, this is about the nutrition unit called Chow Down, when the students are planning the outdoor ed meals. These meals will be great. These meals will be a little confusing. Not ready to eat these meals. Where's the beef? So we have 4 different performance levels. You have a score or a way to rate them, but also an understanding that they are gradually each different levels of quality. And you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 letters. Well, sorry, I was reading letters to supervisor. 5 categories or dimensions: food groups, number of daily portions, 9 meals, letter to supervisor, grammar and conventions for letter. And so you've covered most of the culminating performance task is covered in this rubric. Performance indicators are descriptive and not numerical. And all success criteria for the CPT are addressed. So when you put your success criteria here, they're all going to show up in here. Here's your criteria spot. So each one of these shows up here, and then you describe the different levels of quality of performance. So your task for this module is to design a comprehensive rubric for the GRASP's culminating performance task you designed for Module 9, based on the guidance from this presentation and related readings and video. The criteria that you're going to meet, or the technical criteria, is that the rubric needs to have from 4 performance levels for scoring. I was to 6, but really just keep it at 4. For example, not acceptable to exemplary, and from 4 to 6 maximum dimensions to be scored as appropriate. The content, the rubric must address the goals and objectives of your unit, and specifically the success criteria of the related culminating performance task that you have designed. And then submit your assignment by the due date for feedback. With that, I'll send you off to develop your rubrics. I'm sure that they will more than adequately address the culminating performance tasks that you have designed.